When my husband demanded a divorce on the exact day I buried my father, I stayed completely silent about the $72 million I had just inherited. Thank goodness I kept my mouth shut, because the trap he was about to walk into would cost him everything. My name is Claire, and at 33 years old, I was about to execute the most expensive revenge of my life. I had just walked out of a high-end estate lawyer's office in the financial district. The air outside was thick and humid, perfectly matching the heavy weight pressing down on my chest. My estranged father had been laid to rest that very morning. We had not spoken in years, torn apart by bitter misunderstandings and teenage rebellion that lasted well into my adulthood. Yet sitting in that pristine boardroom with its rich mahogany table, the lawyer had handed me documents that made the room spin. My father was the silent partner in a massive medical technology firm. He had left everything to me. I was the sole beneficiary of a trust fund worth exactly $72 million. I was still shaking standing on the sidewalk and trying to process the sheer magnitude of those numbers when my phone buzzed violently in my hand. It was a text from Gavin, my husband of 5 years. He was a tech sales director who loved his tailored suits, his expensive whiskey, and his corporate titles a little too much. I opened the message expecting a basic condolence, or maybe asking when I would be home. Instead, the text read, "Come home and sign the papers. I am done with you." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your success from a toxic partner who only wanted to see you fail. Trust me, you will want to hear how I handled what came next. For the past 5 years, I had been running a small public relations firm. It was struggling, barely keeping its head above water after a disastrous client fallout the previous year. I worked 80-hour weeks trying to save my business, pouring every ounce of my energy into keeping my dream alive. But Gavin never missed an opportunity to remind me of my failures. To him, my business was a pathetic little hobby, and I was just dead weight dragging down his perfect upwardly mobile lifestyle. He constantly told me I would be on the streets without his paycheck. He chipped away at my self-esteem so systematically that I often believed him. I stood on the street corner, the rain starting to drizzle and stain the fabric of my black morning dress. A normal wife might have called her husband right then, crying, begging for an explanation, or screaming in betrayal. But Gavin had drained my tears years ago. The inheritance documents sitting inside my leather tote bag suddenly felt like a heavy bulletproof shield. I got into my beat-up sedan and drove toward the suburban house we shared. The drive was a blur of gray skies and flashing windshield wipers. My mind raced with the legal implications of what was happening. I was not a fool. I knew that in our state an inheritance is considered separate property, but only if it is kept entirely isolated from joint marital assets. If Gavin found out I was suddenly a multimillionaire, his demands would immediately shift. He would no longer want me just gone. He would drag the divorce out for years, demanding outrageous spousal support and a massive cut of my new fortune to maintain his lavish lifestyle. I had to play this perfectly. I had to remain the broke, pathetic wife he always thought I was. I pulled into the driveway of our pristine neighborhood. The house was a beautiful 4-bedroom property that Gavin had purchased just a few months before we got married. He made sure to keep my name off the deed, a fact he weaponized against me whenever we argued. The rain was pouring down harder now, washing heavily over the manicured lawn and the stone walkway. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and completely froze. There, sitting on the front porch, under the relentless downpour, were my suitcases, 3 large bags thrown together haphazardly. One of them had burst open upon hitting the ground, leaving my favorite blouses and dresses soaking in the muddy water pooling on the concrete steps. He had actually thrown my belongings out into a thunderstorm on the day I buried my father. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. He wanted me broken. He wanted me to crawl up those front steps shivering and desperate, begging him for a roof over my head. He wanted to feel like a god tossing scraps to a peasant. I took a deep, steadying breath, wiped the cold raindrops from my cheek, and grabbed my purse. I stepped out of the car, letting the rain soak my shoulders, and marched toward the porch. The game had officially begun. The heavy oak front door creaked as I pushed it open. Water dripped from my ruined hem onto the pristine hardwood floors of the foyer, creating small dark puddles. Gavin was sitting on the expensive Italian leather sofa in the living room, casually scrolling through his phone. He was wearing a crisp designer button-down shirt and tailored slacks, looking completely relaxed, as if he had not just dumped my entire life onto the wet pavement outside. He did not even look up when I walked in. He just sighed loudly, an exaggerated sound of annoyance, as if my presence was a mosquito buzzing in his ear. "You are tracking mud everywhere," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Not a single word about my father. Not a sliver of basic human empathy for the fact that I had just come from a graveyard. I stood there shivering from the cold rain and stared at the man I had spent the last 5 years of my life with. He finally locked his phone and tossed it aside. Beside it on the glass coffee table was a thick stack of legal documents. He tapped the stack with 2 fingers. "I am not going to drag this out," Gavin said, leaning back and crossing his legs. "Those are the divorce papers. I already signed my part. You need to sign yours. Grab whatever is left of your junk outside and hand over your keys." I walked slowly into the living room, my wet shoes squeaking against the floorboards. "Gavin, my father was buried 4 hours ago," I said, keeping my voice low and trembling, testing the waters to see just how far gone he was. He rolled his eyes, a classic Gavin move whenever anyone else's emotions inconvenienced him. "Do not play the victim card with me, Claire. You two barely spoke. I am not going to sit here and pretend to mourn a guy I met twice just so you can buy more time. I am done. I am completely drained." He stood up, pacing the room, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "For 5 years I have carried you. I have paid the mortgage, I have paid for the groceries, I have funded our lifestyle while you played CEO at that pathetic excuse for a public relations firm. Your business is worthless garbage, Claire. It makes 0 profit. It is a hobby that I have been subsidizing, and I am sick of being your financial safety net." The venom in his voice was palpable. He pointed a finger at my chest, stepping closer so he could tower over me. "I am a director. I am closing massive tech deals while you are begging local businesses to let you run their social media for pennies. It is embarrassing. You are 33 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. You are dead weight, and I refuse to let you drag me down any longer. So you are going to sign those papers today. No lawyers, no fighting. We walk away clean." And the house I asked, making sure to let my voice crack perfectly on the last syllable. "The house is mine," he snapped immediately. "I bought it before we were married. The deed is in my name. The equity is mine. You have absolutely no right to this property, which is why your bags are on the porch. You need to be out by tonight." He was so arrogant, so entirely convinced of his own untouchable superiority. I slid my cold hand into the pocket of my damp coat. My fingers brushed against the thick cream-colored envelope from the estate lawyer. Inside that envelope was the legal proof that I was currently worth $72 million. I could end him right there. I could pull out the document, slap it onto the glass table, and watch the color drain from his smug, handsome face. I could tell him that I could buy this house 10 times over in cash and bulldoze it just for fun. The urge to destroy him in that exact second was intoxicating, but I remembered the lawyer's strict warning about asset division and spousal support. If I showed my hand now, Gavin would morph from an arrogant tyrant into a greedy leech. He would drag me through court for years, demanding half of my new wealth to maintain his lifestyle. I had to let him win this battle so I could completely annihilate him in the war. I took a sharp breath, pulled my empty hand out of my pocket, and let my knees buckle just slightly. I collapsed onto the edge of the armchair, buried my face in my hands, and forced a heavy, racking sob from my chest. I cried loudly, letting the tears mix with the rain on my face. "Please, Gavin." I whimpered through my fingers, making sure to sound as small and pathetic as possible. "Please do not do this today. I have nowhere to go. My business is in debt. I have nothing." I peeked through my fingers just enough to see his reaction. Gavin was standing over me, looking down at my shaking shoulders. He did not look sympathetic. He did not look guilty. He smirked. It was a slow, satisfied smirk of a man who loved watching someone else break under his power. He was thoroughly enjoying his cruelty, completely unaware that my tears were fake and that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. The morning sun glared through the living room windows, offering no warmth to the cold reality of my situation. I had spent the entire night sleeping on the floor of the guest bedroom, surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes I had scavenged from the recycling bin out back. My back ached and my eyes were genuinely swollen from the sheer exhaustion of maintaining my act. I was taping shut a box filled with old college sweaters when I heard the heavy front door swing open. There was no knock. There was no polite warning. Footsteps echoed in the foyer, accompanied by the sharp, authoritative click of expensive designer heels. I stood up, brushing dust off my jeans, just as Nolan and his wife Kendra marched right into the living room. Nolan was Gavin's younger brother. At 31, he was the golden boy of the family, a regional director for a massive commercial real estate firm. He carried the same arrogant posture as my husband, always walking into a room like he owned the building. But it was Kendra who truly commanded the space. Kendra was a stunning African-American woman who came from a wealthy family of corporate lawyers. She never missed an opportunity to remind me of that fact. Today, she was dressed in a pristine white blazer that probably cost more than my car, and slung over her forearm was a genuine leather Birkin bag. She paused in the center of the living room, her eyes sweeping over the scattered cardboard boxes and my messy hair. Her perfect lips curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. She took a step forward and literally kicked a small box of my books out of her way. The cardboard tore and a few paperback novels spilled onto the hardwood floor. "Hurry up, Claire," Kendra said, her tone dripping with boredom. "You really need to pick up the pace. Nolan and I are buying this house from Gavin, and we have contractors coming to measure the backyard. We are going to tear down that ugly patio and build a custom swimming pool. We cannot have your trash sitting around when they get here." I stared at the books on the floor, keeping my head bowed to hide the sudden sharp glare in my eyes. "I am packing as fast as I can," I said, making my voice sound weak and defeated. "You could have given me more than 12 hours' notice." Nolan crossed his arms and scoffed loudly. "Be grateful Gavin is letting you pack at all," he said. "He could have just thrown all this junk straight into the dumpster. You have been leeching off my brother for 5 years. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for our family to watch him drag you and your failing public relations business around? You bring absolutely nothing to the table. He is finally cutting his losses, and quite frankly, it is about time." I knelt down slowly, pretending to be utterly broken by their words, and began picking up the fallen books. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up, pull out my phone, and show them the bank routing numbers for my $72 million trust fund. I wanted to tell Nolan that with one phone call I could buy the exact real estate firm he worked for and fire him before his lunch break. But I bit my tongue. I had to play the long game. The trap was not fully set yet. Kendra sighed dramatically, shifting the heavy designer bag on her arm. She looked down at me as if I were a cockroach that had scuttled across her expensive rug. "Honestly, Claire, you should have seen this coming," Kendra said, her voice dropping into a mocking, sympathetic register. "You never fit in with us. You do not have the background, you do not have the drive, and you certainly do not have the money. A man like Gavin needs a partner who elevates him. He needs a woman who understands business and actually contributes to his success." She paused, letting a cruel, knowing smile spread across her face. She leaned in just a fraction, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Do not feel too bad, though," Kendra whispered. "You just could not compete. Gavin already has a major upgrade waiting in the wings. Someone younger, smarter, and far more equipped to give him the life he deserves. You were just the placeholder." My hands stopped moving. The books slipped from my fingers. I looked up at her, letting my jaw drop in perfectly feigned shock. "An upgrade?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Kendra laughed, a sharp, ringing sound that echoed in the empty living room. She turned on her heel, pulling Nolan toward the kitchen to inspect the countertops, leaving me kneeling in the dust. My heart was racing, but not from heartbreak. It was from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Gavin was not just divorcing me. He was hiding someone else. And if he was hiding someone else, he was definitely hiding marital assets. The puzzle pieces were falling into place perfectly. I wiped a fake tear from my cheek and smiled. I was still kneeling beside my torn cardboard box when the sound of heavy tires crunched onto the driveway. A moment later, Gavin strode through the front door. He was not alone. Trailing closely behind him was a short, balding man in a poorly tailored gray suit clutching a battered leather briefcase. Kendra and Nolan emerged from the kitchen, leaning against the archway with matching expressions of eager anticipation. They were clearly ready for a show. "Claire, get up," Gavin commanded, not bothering to introduce his companion. "We have business to handle." I slowly stood, brushing my hands on my jeans, keeping my posture submissive. The balding man stepped forward, opening his briefcase on top of the dining table. He did not offer his hand. "I am Mr. Caldwell Gavin's legal counsel," the man said, his voice raspy and unpleasant. "We are here to expedite this separation. My client has been exceedingly generous by allowing you to pack your personal items, but we need to address the financial liabilities you have brought into this marriage." He pulled a crisp, single-page document from his briefcase and slapped it onto the table. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. "Let us cut to the chase," Caldwell continued, tapping a cheap pen against the paper. "Your public relations firm is currently carrying $50,000 in business debt. In the eyes of the law, because that debt was accumulated during the marriage, my client could potentially be dragged into your financial mess. However, Gavin is willing to completely absolve himself of any connection to your failing company. He will not sue you for damages, and he will walk away clean." I looked up, making sure my eyes were wide and fearful. "And in exchange for what I asked," my voice trembling perfectly. Gavin crossed his arms and stepped forward, an arrogant sneer plastered across his face. "In exchange for the joint savings account," he said coldly. I gasped, taking a dramatic step back. Our joint account had exactly $30,000 in it. It was money we had supposedly saved together over the last 5 years, though Gavin always made sure to remind me that his paycheck contributed the lion's share. "You cannot be serious," I stammered, wrapping my arms around myself. "That is everything we have saved. That is the only money I have to start over." "It is the only money I have saved," Gavin corrected sharply. "You have contributed nothing but debt. You owe $50,000 to creditors, Claire. If you do not sign this temporary settlement right now, relinquishing your half of the $30,000, my lawyer will file a motion to hold you completely liable for dragging my credit score down. I will drag you through court until you do not even have pennies left to rub together." I looked at Caldwell, then at Gavin, and finally at Nolan and Kendra, who were openly smiling at my supposed misery. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to burst into hysterical laughter. Gavin was threatening me over a measly $30,000. He had actually hired a discount lawyer to bully me out of the equivalent of pocket change, all while I had a trust fund worth $72 million sitting quietly under my name. But a trapped animal fights back, and I needed to play the role of the cornered prey perfectly. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, letting one spill over my cheek. "Please, Gavin," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "I will sign the business debt over. I will take all the liability. But I have absolutely nowhere to live. I need a deposit for an apartment. Just let me keep $5,000. Just $5,000 so I am not sleeping in my car tonight. Please." We were married for 5 years. Gavin looked down at me, his chest puffing out. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of absolute power. He had broken me, or so he thought. "Not a single dime," Claire Gavin said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are lucky I am letting you take your clothes. Sign the paper, or Caldwell files the motion in an hour." I let out a broken sob, picking up the cheap plastic pen. My hand shook violently as I pressed the tip to the paper. I dragged the pen across the signature line, acting as though I was signing away my very life force. Gavin snatched the paper the second the ink dried. He folded it and handed it to Caldwell, exchanging a triumphant look with his brother. He was so utterly blinded by his own massive ego, so intoxicated by the feeling of taking my last $30,000, that he never even considered the possibility that he was the one being played. He had just set the precedent that our finances were completely separated, digging his own grave deeper with every move he made. I sat across from Mr. Harrison, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless wealth management law firms in the state. His office was on the 50th floor, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the city skyline. It was a stark contrast to the cheap, balding lawyer Gavin had brought to our living room just hours ago. Mr. Harrison reviewed the settlement paper I had just been forced to sign. He chuckled, sliding it back across the polished mahogany desk. "Your husband has just done us a massive favor, Claire," Mr. Harrison said, leaning back in his leather chair. "By forcing you to sign away your joint savings to cover your supposed business debt, he has legally established a precedent of financial separation. He is operating under the assumption that you are a sinking ship. We need to keep him believing exactly that." I nodded, taking a sip of the sparkling water his assistant had brought me. "How do we protect the trust fund?" I asked. "The $72 million is currently sitting in an isolated account, but I know how the legal system works. If Gavin finds out I am wealthy before this divorce is finalized, he will not just walk away. He absolutely will not." Mr. Harrison agreed, his expression turning serious. "Under United States divorce law, an inheritance is generally considered separate property. However, the moment your husband discovers its existence, his strategy will change overnight. He will claim that because he financially supported you during your marriage, he is entitled to massive alimony to maintain his standard of living. He will drag you into family court for years. He will request a forensic audit of your public relations firm. He will try to claim that marital funds were somehow commingled with your inheritance. It would be a nightmare." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Gavin was greedy. If he smelled blood in the water, he would transform into a shark. "What is the solution?" I asked, leaning forward. Mr. Harrison placed his hands flat on the desk. "A waiver of financial discovery. It is a legally binding document where both parties explicitly agree to waive their right to investigate each other's financial assets. If Gavin signs it, he legally forfeits his right to ever look into your bank accounts, your business ledgers, or your trust fund. Once the judge signs the final decree, Gavin can never come back for a single dime." I let out a slow breath. "But why would Gavin sign that?" I asked. "He wants to make sure I am suffering. Because we are going to make him think it is his idea," Mr. Harrison said with a sharp smile. "Right now, Gavin believes your business is drowning in $50,000 of debt. He wants to protect his own assets from your creditors. Furthermore, men like Gavin usually have financial secrets of their own. If he is rushing this divorce and kicking you out so aggressively, there is a high probability he is hiding marital assets. If we push him into a corner, he will demand the waiver himself just to protect his own pockets." The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. Kendra had mentioned an upgrade earlier that morning. If Gavin had a mistress, he was definitely spending marital money on her. He had something to hide. I just needed to threaten his perfect image. I thanked Mr. Harrison and took the elevator down to the underground parking garage. The air was cool and quiet. I unlocked my beat-up sedan and sat in the driver's seat, my mind racing with strategies. The trap was coming together perfectly, but I needed a catalyst. I needed to rattle Gavin enough to make him panic. Right on cue, my phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed brightly on the dashboard screen. It was Brenda, my mother-in-law. I took a deep breath, adjusted my voice to sound appropriately defeated, and answered the call. "Hello, Brenda. Claire." My mother-in-law snapped, skipping any form of a greeting. Her voice was sharp and commanding, just like her son's. "I know Gavin has filed the paperwork. Frankly, I am relieved he is finally moving on from this disaster of a marriage. However, my 60th birthday dinner is tomorrow night at the steakhouse downtown." I frowned, confused. "Why are you calling me then?" "Because the reservations were made months ago, and half of our extended family is flying in from out of state," Brenda said, her tone dripping with annoyance. "We have not announced the divorce to the extended family yet. I will not have my milestone birthday ruined by gossip and whispers about my son's failed marriage. You are going to put on a nice dress, show up to the restaurant, and smile. You will play the role of the happy wife for exactly 2 hours." I gripped the steering wheel. "Brenda, Gavin just threw my belongings out into the rain. I am not coming to your dinner. You will be there? Claire." Brenda threatened, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. If you embarrass my son and ruin my dinner, I will personally make sure Gavin takes that pathetic public relations business of yours and buries it in so much legal debt you will never recover. Keep up appearances. Do not make a scene. 8 o'clock sharp. The line went dead. I sat in the silent car staring at the darkened screen of my phone. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Brenda thought she was threatening a helpless victim. She had no idea she had just handed me the exact opportunity I needed to set the final trap. I started the engine. I was definitely going to that dinner. I arrived at the steakhouse precisely at 8 o'clock. The restaurant was a dimly lit, velvet-lined establishment where the cheapest cut of meat cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I handed the keys of my dented sedan to a valet who looked at it with thinly veiled disdain. I smoothed down the plain, slightly faded black dress I had chosen for the evening. It was modest and understated, the perfect costume for a woman who was supposedly losing everything and drowning in debt. The hostess guided me down a long, elegant hallway toward a private dining room in the back. As the heavy mahogany doors swung open, the warm sound of laughter and clinking crystal washed over me. I stepped inside, and the room immediately felt like a carefully constructed theater set designed entirely for my humiliation. Seated at the center of the long banquet table was Gavin. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit, laughing loudly at something his brother Nolan had just said. But he was not sitting alone. Tucked intimately against his side with his arm wrapped securely around her waist was Sienna. Sienna was Gavin's 28-year-old administrative assistant. She was young, vibrant, and wearing a clinging silk dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. More importantly, the dress perfectly accentuated a very visible, undeniable baby bump. The sheer audacity of the scene took my breath away for a fraction of a second. He had not just brought his mistress to his mother's birthday dinner, he had brought his pregnant mistress, displaying her like a trophy to the entire extended family, while I, his legal wife of 5 years, was expected to sit quietly in the corner. I stood near the doorway, waiting for anyone to acknowledge the insane cruelty of this setup. Instead, the family completely ignored me. Aunts and uncles who had smiled at my wedding were now busy fawning over Sienna. Kendra was leaning across the table admiring the way Sienna had styled her hair, while Nolan clapped Gavin on the shoulder in a gesture of brotherly pride. "Claire, you are late!" Brenda snapped from the head of the table. My mother-in-law was dripping in pearls, glaring at me over the rim of her wineglass. "Sit down before the servers bring the appetizers. You are blocking the doorway." She pointed to a single empty chair at the very far end of the table, as far away from Gavin and the center of attention as physically possible. I kept my eyes lowered, letting my shoulders slump as I silently walked over and took my seat. I did not cause a scene. I did not scream. I just sat there acting like a broken, submissive woman who had finally accepted her tragic fate. Throughout the dinner, the isolation was suffocating. Servers brought out massive seafood towers and thick cuts of prime rib, pouring expensive champagne into every glass except mine, as Brenda had specifically instructed them to only give me tap water. I picked at my food, keeping my ears wide open. I listened as Sienna giggled, talking loudly about the expensive nursery furniture Gavin had just ordered. I listened as Kendra asked Sienna about her prenatal yoga classes. The entire family had clearly known about this affair for months. They had all been complicit in my betrayal. As the dessert plates were being cleared, Brenda stood up and tapped a silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The room instantly quieted down. Gavin pulled Sienna a little closer, kissing her temple while everyone watched with adoring eyes. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate my 60th birthday." Brenda began, her voice echoing in the private room. "This year has brought a lot of changes to our family. Some doors have closed, but more importantly, new and beautiful doors have opened." She turned her gaze directly toward Gavin and Sienna, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "We are moving into a new chapter. A chapter filled with prosperity, success, and finally new life." Brenda raised her glass higher, her eyes suddenly darting down the table to lock onto mine. The warmth in her expression vanished, replaced by a cold, triumphant glare. To Sienna, Brenda said, her voice ringing out clearly so that every single person in the room could hear. Finally, a woman who can give this family an heir. And more importantly, a woman who actually knows how to support a successful man, unlike some useless people who only know how to drag us down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the table. Kendra smirked, taking a sip of her drink. Gavin beamed with pride. Sienna placed a manicured hand over her baby bump and blushed, soaking in the cruel praise. I sat at the end of the table, gripping my cloth napkin until my knuckles turned white. I forced my eyes to well up with tears, letting one escape and slide down my cheek for everyone to see. I let them enjoy their victory. I let Brenda believe her vicious toast had completely shattered my spirit. But beneath the table, out of their sight, my other hand was calmly resting on my phone, pulling up the digital bank statement that would turn this entire celebration into a waking nightmare. The clinking of glasses faded as the servers began to clear the dessert plates. Kendra leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto Sienna's chest. She let out a loud, exaggerated gasp of admiration that drew the attention of everyone in the room. "Sienna, is that the new Cartier diamond drop necklace?" Kendra asked, her voice echoing in the private dining space. Sienna blushed deeply, her hand fluttering up to touch the sparkling diamonds resting against her collarbone. She looked up at Gavin with adoring eyes. "It is," she said softly but loud enough for the whole family to hear. "Gavin surprised me with it last week to celebrate the baby. He is just so incredibly generous to us." Gavin leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest and unbuttoning his suit jacket. He soaked up the admiring glances from his uncles and brother. "Nothing is too good for the mother of my child," Gavin declared proudly. The table erupted into a fresh round of coos and congratulations. Brenda wiped a fake tear of joy from her eye. I sat at the far end of the table, perfectly still. The fake tear I had shed just moments ago had already dried on my cheek. I reached for my glass of tap water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down quietly. The time for playing the completely broken victim was over for tonight. I needed to insert just enough panic into Gavin's mind to make him rush the financial paperwork. I opened my small black clutch and pulled out my phone along with a precisely folded piece of paper I had printed at the office that afternoon. I stood up slowly, the screech of my wooden chair pushing back against the hardwood floor cut through the chatter. Every head turned to look at me, their expressions instantly hardening with annoyance. "That really is a beautiful necklace, Sienna," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotion. Brenda slammed her hand on the table. "Sit down, Claire. We are not interested in your jealous remarks. You have ruined enough of this evening just by being here." I ignored my mother-in-law entirely, keeping my eyes locked on Sienna, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "The diamonds really complement your dress," I continued, taking a few steps toward the center of the table. "But I have to say it is pretty bold of you to wear it in front of me, especially considering the fact that I paid for half of it." The room went completely silent. Gavin sat up straight, his smug expression instantly vanishing. "What are you talking about, you crazy woman?" Gavin spat, his face flushing red. "Stop embarrassing yourself and sit down." I did not sit down. Instead, I unfolded the piece of paper in my hand and tossed it right into the center of the table, letting it land squarely next to the floral centerpiece. It was a blown-up copy of our joint marital credit card statement. I had highlighted a specific transaction from 4 days ago in bright yellow ink. $15,000 spent at the Cartier boutique downtown, I read aloud, making sure my voice carried to the furthest corners of the room. "Thanks for helping my husband max out our joint marital credit card, Sienna. It is funny, Gavin, because just this morning your discount lawyer told me I had to give you my entire life savings to cover my business debt. Yet here you are draining our shared credit line to buy diamonds for your mistress." Nolan grabbed the paper, his eyes scanning the highlighted charge. Kendra looked over his shoulder, her jaw dropping. Sienna quickly let go of the necklace as if the diamonds had suddenly caught fire. Gavin stood up, kicking his chair back. "You have no right to snoop through my finances," he yelled, his voice cracking slightly with panic. "It is a joint account, Gavin," I replied calmly. "My name is on the primary billing statement. And unfortunately for you, spending shared marital funds on an affair partner has a specific legal term. It is called dissipation of marital assets." I looked around the table at the stunned faces of his family. The superiority they had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by shock and quiet murmurs. I turned my attention back to my husband, who was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "My lawyer is going to have a field day with this," I told him, keeping my tone light and conversational. "When I show this to a family court judge, they will not just make you pay me back every single penny of that $15,000. They will freeze your accounts and audit every purchase you have made for the last 2 years to see what else you have been hiding. They are going to absolutely tear your finances apart, Gavin." The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Brenda sat frozen with her mouth slightly open, staring at her son in horror. The golden boy image had just been cracked wide open. Gavin looked like a deer caught in the headlights, realizing for the first time that his actions had legal consequences. He was terrified of an audit. He knew that if a judge looked closely at his money, they would find the $500,000 he was currently trying to funnel into his fake startup. I picked up my small black clutch and pushed my chair in. "Enjoy your prime rib, everyone," I said smoothly. "Happy birthday, Brenda." I turned my back on the silent room and walked out of the restaurant, my heels clicking confidently against the floor. I had just thrown the bait. Now all I had to do was wait for Gavin to panic and suggest the financial waiver himself. The cool night air hit my face the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse. I did not wait for the valet. I had parked my dented sedan myself in the far back corner of the lot, well away from the luxury vehicles lining the front entrance. The gravel crunched beneath my heels as I walked briskly, my heart pounding a steady rhythmic drum in my chest. The confrontation inside had gone perfectly, but the adrenaline was still coursing through my veins. I was just reaching into my purse for my car keys when I heard the sharp, aggressive thud of footsteps rapidly approaching from behind. "Claire, stop right there." Gavin's voice sliced through the quiet parking lot. I turned just as he closed the distance between us. His face was flushed, the veins in his neck bulging against the crisp collar of his expensive dress shirt. The smug, untouchable golden boy from the dinner table was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, angry man whose carefully constructed illusion had just been shattered. I took a step back, my spine pressing against the cold metal door of my car. Gavin did not stop. He moved into my personal space, slamming his open palm against the roof of my sedan. The loud bang echoed in the empty lot, designed to make me flinch. I let my breath hitch, keeping up the act of the intimidated wife. "You think you are so smart, do you not?" Gavin hissed, his face inches from mine. "You think you can walk into my mother's birthday dinner, disrespect my family, and threaten me with an audit? You have lost your mind, Claire." I clutched my purse to my chest. "You spent $15,000 of our joint money on your mistress, Gavin. The court is going to look at everything. They are going to freeze your accounts." "Shut up about the court," he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You are not taking another dime from me. You are nothing but a pathetic gold digger. You spent 5 years leeching off my salary running a failing public relations business that makes absolutely zero profit. Now that I am finally cutting you loose, you want to squeeze me for whatever you can get. You are pathetic." The irony of being called a gold digger by a man who was fighting over a credit card bill while I had a $72 million trust fund secured in my name was almost too delicious to bear. But I swallowed the laugh that threatened to bubble up in my throat. I needed him to stay angry. I needed him to feel like he had to destroy me to protect himself. "I am just fighting for what is fair," I whispered, making my voice sound small and shaky. "I told you I need money to live. If you do not give me my share, my lawyer will file the paperwork to investigate your business accounts tomorrow morning." Gavin leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Let me make something perfectly clear to you, Claire. If you even try to mention the word audit to a judge, I will completely destroy you. I am a director in this city. I have corporate connections you cannot even fathom. I will call every single client on your pathetic little roster and tell them your public relations firm is under investigation for fraud. I will make sure you are blacklisted from every agency in the state. You will not just be broke. You will be completely unemployable." He sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Do you understand me? You will drop this dissipation nonsense or I will bury you." I let out a soft gasp, nodding quickly as if his threat had terrified me to my core. Okay, I said, my voice trembling. Just let me leave, Gavin. Please. He held my gaze for a long, menacing second before finally stepping back in disgust. He pulled his hand away from the roof of my car, wiping his palm on his slacks as if touching my vehicle had contaminated him. Get out of here, he spat. And do not ever threaten me again. I fumbled with my keys, my hands deliberately shaking as I unlocked the car. I slipped into the driver's seat and immediately slammed the door shut, hitting the lock button, so the heavy clunk echoed in the quiet night. I started the engine, threw the car into gear, and pulled out of the parking space. Gavin stood in the rearview mirror, a dark silhouette bathed in the red glow of my taillights. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. As I drove down the street away from the steakhouse and the toxic family, I was finally leaving behind the mask of the terrified victim melted away. I reached up, adjusting the rearview mirror, and a slow, icy smile spread across my lips. Gavin was not just angry, he was terrified. He was so desperate to protect his hidden $500,000 from an audit that he would do anything to keep my lawyers out of his financial records. His threat to destroy my business was nothing but a smokescreen. The seed had been planted perfectly. I knew with absolute certainty that by tomorrow morning, Gavin would be the one begging me to sign a legal waiver to separate our assets forever. He was running right toward the edge of the cliff, and he was about to jump off completely on his own. The morning after the disastrous birthday dinner, my phone rang before the sun even crested the horizon. I was sitting at the small kitchen table of a short-term rental apartment I had secured late last night, sipping black coffee. It was Mr. Harrison, my wealth management attorney. He sounded energized, a sharp contrast to the early hour. He told me to come to his office immediately. We had caught our rat. An hour later, I was back on the 50th floor, sitting in the plush leather chair across from Mr. Harrison. Sitting next to him was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who was introduced to me simply as Donovan. Donovan was a high-end private investigator who usually handled corporate espionage and high-asset divorces. His hourly rate was astronomical, but thanks to my $72 million trust fund, he was officially on my payroll. Donovan opened a thick manila folder and began spreading glossy photographs and printed documents across the polished mahogany desk. Your little performance at the steakhouse worked perfectly, Claire Donovan said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. Gavin panicked. The moment you drove out of that parking lot, he did not go back inside to finish his prime rib. He made a frantic phone call to his brother Nolan, and they met at an all-night diner on the edge of town. Donovan tapped a photograph showing Gavin and Nolan sitting in a vinyl booth, looking over a laptop screen with expressions of pure stress. My team has been monitoring your husband's financial footprint for the last 48 hours, Donovan continued. We knew he had a significant amount of cash hidden somewhere, mostly from undisclosed quarterly bonuses and under-the-table commissions he never reported on your joint taxes. It totals exactly $500,000. When you threatened him with a forensic audit last night, he realized his standard offshore hiding spots were not going to withstand a judge's scrutiny. He needed a way to make the money completely disappear from his personal ledger before you filed any legal discovery motions. I leaned forward, looking at the documents. So what did he do? He leaned on his brother. Mr. Harrison interjected with a cold smile. Nolan is a regional director for a major commercial real estate firm. He knows how corporate structures work. He knows how to hide ownership behind layers of paperwork. Last night, Nolan helped your husband expedite the formation of a fake tech startup. Donovan pushed a freshly stamped legal document toward me. It is a shell company registered in Delaware, a state notorious for protecting corporate anonymity. Nolan used his connections to draft a ghost lease for a fake office space, making the startup look like a legitimate operating business. Gavin immediately began wiring his hidden $500,000 into the startup's business accounts, labeling the transfers as aggressive seed investments for a new software venture. I stared at the LLC filing. The registered agent was a generic proxy service, but the paper trail Donovan had uncovered connected straight back to Gavin's personal IP address. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. He is laundering his own money, I said, the realization washing over me. Exactly, Mr. Harrison said. Gavin is funneling all his liquid cash into this fake company. His plan is incredibly transparent, but it would have worked against a normal, underfunded spouse. When you go to court, Gavin is going to claim that his tech startup completely failed overnight. He will say the $500,000 was lost in bad business investments. He will show the judge empty personal bank accounts and claim he is on the verge of bankruptcy. Donovan nodded in agreement. He wants the court to think he is completely broke. That way, he does not have to pay you a single dime in alimony, and he forces you to take on the debt of your public relations firm by yourself. Once the divorce is finalized and you are safely out of the picture, the startup will miraculously dissolve, and the money will quietly filter back into a new account shared by Gavin and his mistress. They thought they were untouchable. They thought because Nolan wore a fancy suit and threw around real estate jargon, they could outsmart the federal banking system and the family courts. They had no idea they were playing against a woman with the resources to hire investigators who tracked international cartels. Donovan slid the final document across the table. It was the master banking ledger for the shell company, proving without a shadow of a doubt that the money was being hidden to defraud a spouse. I picked up the paper, my eyes tracing the massive transfer amounts. My husband and his golden boy brother had not just committed marital asset dissipation. By falsifying corporate documents and hiding assets to prepare for a fraudulent bankruptcy, they had committed federal crimes. I ran my thumb over the edge of the paper, a deep, satisfying warmth spreading through my chest. I did not just have leverage for a divorce anymore. I had his head on a platter. I left the law office that afternoon with the master banking ledger safely locked inside my briefcase. The sense of power was intoxicating. For 5 years, Gavin had made me feel small, incompetent, and utterly dependent on his corporate salary. Now I held the absolute destruction of his entire life in my hands. I was just pulling into the parking lot of my temporary apartment when my phone buzzed violently on the passenger seat. It was an urgent text message from Gavin. "Meet me at the coffee shop on 4th Street in 20 minutes. We need to talk right now. Do not be late." I stared at the screen, a genuine smile touching my lips. Mr. Harrison was right. The threat of a financial audit had completely terrified him. Gavin was accelerating his timeline. He was moving exactly the way we had predicted. I did not bother changing my clothes. I kept on the simple, slightly wrinkled blouse I had been wearing all day, ensuring I still looked like a stressed, overwhelmed woman whose life was falling apart. I drove to the cafe, a busy, slightly noisy spot, filled with college students and remote workers, typing away on their laptops. The loud hiss of the espresso machine and the chatter of the afternoon crowd provided the perfect cover for our meeting. I spotted Gavin sitting in a corner booth near the back. He had clearly put a lot of effort into looking like a man on the edge of a breakdown. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. The top button of his expensive dress shirt was undone, and his tie was pulled loose. He was staring intensely at his phone, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. It was an impressive performance, but I knew the only thing he was actually stressed about was the possibility of a judge finding his secret $500,000. I walked over and slid into the booth across from him. He did not offer to buy me a coffee. He did not even say hello. Gavin immediately reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He dropped it onto the table between us with a heavy thud. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and ran a hand over his face to feign absolute exhaustion. "I am ruining my life, Claire," Gavin said, his voice laced with manufactured panic. "That startup I mentioned, the software venture I invested in, it is completely tanking. My partners pulled out this morning. I am bleeding money, and if I do not restructure my finances immediately, I'm going to have to file for bankruptcy." I widened my eyes, letting my jaw drop slightly. "What do you mean you are bankrupt?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly pitched with fake concern. "You are a director, Gavin. You make 6 figures. I dumped all my liquid cash into this venture," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "It was a massive risk and it failed. I am completely broke, and right now the creditors are looking for blood." He slid the manila envelope across the table. I opened the clasp and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. The bold heading at the top read, Post-Nuptial Separation Agreement. I flipped to the second page, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until I found exactly what I was looking for. There it was, buried under a mountain of complicated phrasing. Clause 7. A strict legally binding waiver of financial discovery. It explicitly stated that both parties permanently waived their right to audit, investigate, or lay claim to any financial accounts, assets, inheritances, or businesses held by the other party. I have to protect myself. Gavin continued, his tone shifting back to his usual arrogant condescension. And frankly, Claire, I am protecting you too. Your public relations firm is already $50,000 in the hole. My startup is hundreds of thousands of dollars in the red. If we do not separate our financial liabilities completely right now, my creditors could come after your failing business, and your creditors could come after my remaining assets. I looked up from the paper, letting my hands tremble just a little bit. You want to completely sever our finances before the divorce is even finalized? I asked, acting as though I was terrified by the prospect. Gavin leaned across the table, his eyes locked onto mine. He thought he was playing a master stroke. He thought he was saving his $500,000 from my lawyers, completely unaware that he was building a massive iron wall between himself and my $72 million trust fund. Just sign the waiver. Claire, Gavin lied smoothly, his voice dropping to a persuasive, almost gentle whisper. We keep what is in our own names. We take our own debts. Clean break. I stared at the thick stack of papers sitting between us. The ambient noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade into a dull hum. Gavin was watching me like a hawk, his eyes darting between my face and the pen resting next to the document. He had planned this perfectly, or so he thought. He raised his hand and gestured to a woman sitting at a small table just a few feet away. She immediately stood up, adjusting her glasses, and walked over with a small leather pouch. This is Marissa, Gavin explained, not even bothering to introduce her properly. She is a licensed mobile notary. I paid her to meet us here so we can make this official right now. No delays, Claire. We sign it, she stamps it, and we walk away forever. I looked at Marissa, who offered a tight professional smile and then back down at the document. It was time for the final act. I took a deep, shuddering breath, making sure my shoulders slumped in defeat. I reached out and let my fingertips lightly touch the edge of the paper. I deliberately made my hands shake. It was not entirely fake, though. The sheer magnitude of what was about to happen was sending genuine adrenaline rushing through my veins. Are you absolutely sure about this? I asked, letting my voice crack perfectly in the middle of the sentence. I looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. Gavin, this means we are completely done. Every financial tie. Everything we built. That is exactly what it means. Gavin said, his voice hard and impatient. He tapped the table right next to the signature line. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I told you I am drowning in my own startup debt, and I cannot afford to bail out your public relations firm when it finally goes under. I pulled my hand back, crossing my arms defensively over my chest. I sniffled, looking down at my lap. You promise you will not try to take my company? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I know it is in debt right now, but I built it from the ground up. It is all I have left. You promise you will not come after it if I manage to turn it around? Gavin actually laughed out loud. It was a cruel, harsh sound that turned the heads of a few college students sitting nearby. Claire, he scoffed, leaning back in the booth and crossing his arms with absolute disdain. I do not want your pathetic little business. It is a sinking ship. It makes zero profit. It has zero valuable assets, and I am not going to let your creditors drag my name through the mud. I am legally separating myself from you and your $50,000 debt. You can keep your little hobby. I promise I will never ask you for a single dime from it. Just sign the paper. I bit my lip, forcing one single tear to spill over my lower lash line and track slowly down my cheek. I reached for the pen. The black plastic felt heavy in my trembling fingers. I hovered the tip of the pen over the dotted line. Gavin held his breath. I could see the pulse beating rapidly in his neck. He was terrified I was going to change my mind and back out, forcing him to undergo the financial audit I had threatened him with the night before. He thought his $500,000 was on the line. He thought he was outsmarting the legal system. I pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the ballpoint against the heavy cardstock was the loudest sound in the world. I signed my name slowly, letting the ink bleed just slightly at the edges to make it look like the signature of a woman breaking down in grief. As soon as I lifted the pen, Gavin practically snatched the paper out from under my hand. He signed his own name so fast, the ink smeared across the page. He shoved the document toward Marissa, the notary. Marissa checked our driver licenses, made us sign her official ledger, and pulled a heavy metal stamp from her leather pouch. She pressed it down onto the bottom of the page. The loud, solid thud of the notary stamp hitting the wooden table echoed in my ears. It was done. The trap had officially snapped shut. Gavin let out a massive theatrical sigh of relief, slumping back against the vinyl booth. He thought he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He thought he had successfully hidden his money and dodged a massive bullet. He had absolutely no idea that with one frantic stroke of a pen, he had just legally, permanently, and irrevocably waived his right to $72 million. I wiped the fake tear from my cheek, keeping my head bowed so he could not see the triumphant smile spreading across my face. Marissa the notary packed her heavy metal stamp into her leather pouch and walked out the glass doors of the coffee shop. The very second the door swung shut behind her, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere at our table completely vanished. Gavin did not just relax, he transformed entirely. The anxious, exhausted posture he had been faking for the last 20 minutes evaporated into thin air. He sat up straight, rolled his shoulders back, and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut right through the ambient chatter of the cafe. He did not even wait for me to put my copy of the legally binding agreement into my purse. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and dialed a number. He pressed the speaker button and placed the phone right in the center of the wooden table directly over the exact spot where the contract had just been signed. The phone rang twice before a familiar, breathy voice answered. "Did it work?" Sienna asked, her voice laced with eager anticipation. Gavin leaned back in the vinyl booth, lacing his fingers behind his head. "It worked perfectly," he declared, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated arrogance. "The idiot actually signed it. She bought the whole failing startup story without a single question. Our money is completely untouchable, and we are officially protected from her pathetic $50,000 business debt. We are in the clear, baby." I sat there perfectly still, staring at the phone on the table. He was not even trying to hide his cruelty. He wanted me to hear this. He wanted to humiliate me in public, to assert his dominance one final time. Through the tiny speaker, Sienna let out a high, grating giggle that made my blood run cold. "Oh my God, Gavin, you are a genius," she praised him. I cannot believe she fell for that. I was so worried her discount lawyers were going to try and freeze your accounts. "Is she sitting right there with you?" "Right across from me," Gavin replied, looking me dead in the eye with a cold, deadpan smirk. "She is practically shaking." "It is pathetic." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and tapped the glass screen of his phone. "Listen to me very carefully, Claire," he ordered, his tone suddenly dropping into a harsh, authoritative bark. "You have exactly until 5 o'clock this evening to get the rest of your trash out of my house. Sienna is bringing her interior decorator over at 6 to start measuring the guest room for the nursery. If your cheap cardboard boxes are still sitting in the foyer when we get there, I am dragging them out to the curb and setting them on fire." He reached out and ended the call without waiting for my response. He grabbed his briefcase, stood up, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me sitting alone in the booth. I did not say a word. I simply zipped my purse closed, slid out of the seat, and walked out to my car, keeping my head down to play the part of the defeated wife. But the moment the heavy car doors locked, I let out a long, deep breath. He actually thought he was a genius. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He had just gloated on speakerphone about hiding assets, completely unaware that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I started the engine and drove straight back to the house to gather the last of my belongings. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed a sleek black luxury SUV parked out front. It belonged to Kendra. I walked through the front door and found my sister-in-law standing in the hallway. She was wearing a pristine silk blouse, sipping an iced latte, and holding her smartphone high in the air. She was actively recording a video. "Well, look who it is," Kendra announced to her phone camera, panning the lens to catch my entrance. The ex-wife finally packing up. I ignored her completely. I walked past her to grab the last two heavy boxes of my office supplies from the corner of the living room. I hoisted them into my arms, the rough cardboard digging painfully into my skin. As I walked back toward the front door, Kendra stepped right into my path, forcing me to maneuver awkwardly around her to avoid dropping my things. She held her phone mere inches from my face, capturing my struggle and my unkempt appearance. "Make sure you do not scratch the hardwood on your way out, Claire," she mocked loudly. "We are having it refinished next week." I carried the boxes out to my trunk and slammed it shut. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the ignition, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened the Instagram app. Kendra had already uploaded the video to her story. It featured a slow-motion clip of me carrying the heavy boxes out the front door, visibly struggling under the weight. Superimposed over the footage in bold, sparkling pink letters was the caption, "Taking out the trash." I sat in the driveway staring at the screen. A genuine, terrifying smile stretched across my face. They were so incredibly eager to kick me to the curb, completely oblivious to the fact that I was about to buy the ground they were standing on. The morning after I carried my cardboard boxes out of my former home, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. It was Mr. Harrison. The post-nuptial separation agreement, complete with the strict financial waiver of discovery, had been officially filed and processed by the county clerk. Gavin and I were now legally and permanently severed on paper. He had successfully built an impenetrable wall to protect his hidden $500,000, completely unaware that the very same wall was protecting my empire. I dressed quickly and drove straight to the wealth management firm. When I walked into Mr. Harrison's office, he was already waiting for me with a sleek silver laptop open on his mahogany desk. He turned the screen toward me and stepped back. I sat down and looked at the glowing banking dashboard. There it was, $72 million. The numbers were so massive they almost did not look real. For 5 years, I had been forced to beg for grocery money. I had endured Gavin calling me a financial burden, and Kendra mocking my lack of designer clothes. Now sitting in that high-backed leather chair, I was richer than all of them combined. I felt a profound, heavy sense of calm wash over me. The time for playing the weeping, terrified victim was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive. I closed the laptop and looked up at my attorney. "Gavin thinks he is safe because he laundered his money through his brother," I said, my voice cold and steady. "So we are going to tear his brother down first." Nolan was a regional director at Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate, one of the most prestigious property management firms in the state. He built his entire identity around his corporate title. It funded the luxury SUV parked in his driveway, Kendra's expensive handbag collection, and the arrogant smirk he wore every time he looked at me. More importantly, Nolan had used his high-level access at Pinnacle to draft the fake office lease and set up the shell company Gavin was using to hide his marital assets. Nolan was the architect of Gavin's fraud. "I want to buy his company," I told Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "That is a bold move, Claire. Pinnacle is a massive entity. I have $72 million sitting in cash," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "Find out who holds the majority shares and make them an offer they cannot refuse." Over the next 48 hours, my legal team moved with terrifying speed and precision. Through a newly established holding company that completely masked my identity, Mr. Harrison approached the board of directors at Pinnacle. As it turned out, the firm was secretly struggling with a severe liquidity crisis following a series of bad commercial investments. They were desperate for a cash injection. My team dropped a $20 million cash offer onto the table to aggressively buy out 51% of the company's voting shares. It was an overwhelming sum of money delivered with a tight deadline. the current shareholders folded almost immediately. The paperwork was drawn up, signed, and wired before the week was over. The transaction was swift, brutal, and entirely confidential. On Thursday morning, I sat in Mr. Harrison's office once again as he placed the finalized corporate takeover documents on the desk. He handed me a heavy gold pen. "You are officially the absolute majority shareholder of Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate," Mr. Harrison announced, watching me sign the final page. "You own the company. You control the board. You are Nolan's ultimate boss. What is your first order of business?" I set the pen down, savoring the absolute power resting at my fingertips. I did not even have to think about it. The strategy had been crystal clear since the moment Kendra posted that mocking video of me struggling with my boxes. "I want you to initiate a full forensic financial audit on the entire regional division," I commanded, my voice ringing with authority. "Bring in the most ruthless, aggressive corporate auditors you can find. Have them lock down the servers without any prior warning. I want them to scrutinize every single lease, every wire transfer, and every ghost company connected to Nolan's desk." I leaned back in the leather chair, looking out the massive glass window at the city skyline below. "I want every dirty secret he has ever hidden dragged out into the light," I said softly. "Because once the auditors find Gavin's fake startup hidden in Nolan's files, both of those arrogant men are going to lose absolutely everything." While my newly acquired team of forensic auditors descended upon Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate to rip Nolan's division apart, my soon-to-be ex-husband was busy celebrating his perceived victory. Gavin and Sienna were spending their Friday afternoon touring an exclusive gated community on the affluent north side of the city. The property they had zeroed in on was a stunning, sprawling $1.2 million suburban mansion. It featured a sweeping circular driveway, perfectly manicured hedges, and a grand entrance with double mahogany doors. Inside the house was an absolute masterpiece of modern luxury. It boasted vaulted ceilings, imported marble countertops, and a massive wall of windows overlooking a serene private lake. Sienna was pacing through the master suite, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pristine hardwood floors. She was already mentally decorating the space, running her hands lovingly over the custom cabinetry in the enormous walk-in closet. "This is it," Sienna said, turning to him with a brilliant, greedy smile. "This is the exact house I have been dreaming of. The guest room down the hall is absolutely perfect for the nursery. We can hire that high-end decorator from the city to do the walls in a soft pastel. It is going to be incredibly gorgeous." Gavin stood in the center of the massive bedroom, his hands tucked confidently into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He looked out the window at the lake, feeling like a conquering king who had just won a massive war. He had kicked his supposedly worthless wife to the curb, secured his shiny new family, and successfully shielded his $500,000 in stolen marital funds behind a fake startup and a rock-solid legal waiver. "It is ours, baby," Gavin promised, walking over and wrapping his arms around her waist. "As soon as my divorce is finalized next month, I will pull the funds from my new venture. We can put down a massive cash deposit and finance the rest. That pathetic ex-wife of mine is probably living in a cheap motel right now, crying over her business debt while we are upgrading to a mansion." They shared a cruel laugh, entirely wrapped up in their own toxic delusion. But their celebration was suddenly interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing up the grand wooden staircase. Their real estate agent, a sharply dressed woman named Patricia, appeared in the doorway of the master suite. She did not have the usual bright, eager smile of a realtor about to close a massive commission. Instead, she looked pale, incredibly nervous, and was clutching her leather portfolio tightly against her chest. She took a deep breath, deliberately avoiding Gavin's eyes. "Patricia," Gavin said smoothly, stepping away from Sienna and adjusting his expensive cuffs. "We have made our decision. Draw up the paperwork right now. We want to put an official offer in today. We are willing to go 5% over asking price just to lock it down immediately." Patricia swallowed hard, shifting her weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "I am so sorry, Gavin." She started, her voice trembling slightly. "But I cannot take your offer. The house is no longer on the market." Gavin frowned, the arrogant smile slipping right off his face. What do you mean it is no longer on the market? We toured it yesterday and you told me the sellers were absolutely desperate. You said we had until the end of the week to submit a formal bid. I know exactly what I said. Patricia apologized, taking a cautious step back, as Gavin's tone grew sharp and demanding. But the situation changed drastically this morning. About an hour ago, the listing agent received an aggressive all-cash offer. It was completely unprecedented. The buyer offered 20% over the asking price, completely waived the home inspection, and wired the entire purchase amount directly into escrow within 30 minutes. The sellers accepted immediately. The paperwork is already signed and the title is currently being transferred. It is gone, Gavin. Sienna let out a sharp gasp, her hands dropping to her sides. No, she whined, stepping forward. That is impossible. You cannot just sell it out from under us. We had a verbal agreement. Gavin's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of red. The veins in his neck began to bulge aggressively against his collar. A verbal agreement means something in this industry, Patricia? He shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings. Who the hell drops over $1 million in cash on a Tuesday morning without even seeing the inspection report? Who is the buyer? Patricia held her hands up defensively. I do not know, Gavin. The buyer purchased the property through a blind trust. It is completely anonymous. I am just as shocked as you are, but the deal is completely finalized. There is absolutely nothing I can do. Gavin completely lost his mind. He grabbed a heavy brass staging lamp from the bedside table and hurled it violently across the room. It shattered against the beautiful marble fireplace, sending pieces of glass and metal flying across the hardwood floor. Patricia shrieked and backed out into the hallway, terrified of his sudden violent outburst. I am a director! Gavin screamed at the empty room, his carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated businessman completely shattering into pieces. My brother runs the biggest commercial real estate firm in this city. You do not do this to me. You do not steal my house. He stood in the center of the master suite, panting heavily, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Sienna was crying, mourning the sudden loss of her perfect nursery. Neither of them had the slightest clue that the anonymous cash buyer, who had just effortlessly ripped their dream house right out of their hands, was the very same woman they thought was currently drowning in poverty. I had bought their mansion with pocket change, and the real nightmare was just about to begin. I spent my final night as a supposedly broke and defeated woman in the sprawling penthouse suite of the most exclusive luxury hotel downtown. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline, a glittering sea of lights stretching out into the dark. I stood by the glass holding a crystal goblet of a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon that cost more than my first car. The plush silk robe draped over my shoulders was a stark contrast to the faded, wrinkled clothes I had been wearing for the past week to maintain my facade. A soft, polite knock echoed through the massive suite. I set my wineglass down on a marble side table and walked over to open the heavy double doors. Mr. Harrison and Donovan stood in the hallway, both carrying thick leather briefcases that looked like they weighed 50 pounds each. I ushered them inside and guided them toward the private dining area of the penthouse, where a catered spread of artisan cheeses and cured meats was already waiting. Donovan did not waste any time. He opened his briefcase first and began pulling out stacks of paper tagged with bright red evidence markers. The forensic audit team you deployed at Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate moved faster than any corporate lockdown I have ever witnessed, Donovan said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the large room. They walked into the regional office right after lunch. Nolan did not even have time to log out of his computer or shred a single document before corporate security stepped in and escorted him out of the building. The look on his face when they confiscated his company phone and laptop was apparently priceless. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, spreading the audit summaries across the polished marble table. They found absolutely everything, Claire, my lawyer, explained, pointing to a highlighted bank ledger. The auditors uncovered the fabricated lease agreement for the fake software startup. They traced every single wire transfer Gavin made from his hidden commission funds directly into the shell company. The paper trail is undeniable. Gavin has officially committed fraud, and Nolan is entirely complicit as the facilitator. Donovan leaned against the table, a grim, highly satisfied smile crossing his face. But the audit revealed something even better, Donovan added. It turns out Gavin was not the only brother living a lie. While tearing through the division's financial records, the auditors discovered that Nolan has been heavily embezzling from Pinnacle for the last 3 years. He was siphoning corporate client funds through fake vendor invoices to pay for his luxury SUV, his expensive country club memberships, and his wife Kendra's extensive designer handbag collection. I stared at the documents, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their arrogance. They had built their entire wealthy, snobby personas on stolen money, and now I owned the company they had stolen from. Because you are the majority shareholder of Pinnacle, Mr. Harrison said smoothly, you have the absolute authority to press federal charges for the embezzlement. Both your husband and your brother-in-law are not just looking at financial ruin. They are facing serious prison time. I reached out and traced my finger over the printed evidence of their absolute destruction. The trap was flawlessly set. Every piece was locked perfectly into place. Just as I was about to pour Mr. Harrison a glass of wine to celebrate the victory, my phone buzzed sharply on the marble counter. I picked it up. It was a text message from Gavin. Even after throwing a violent tantrum over losing his dream mansion to an anonymous cash buyer that afternoon, his massive ego still demanded that he punch down to make himself feel powerful. I unlocked the screen and read the message aloud to my lawyer and my private investigator. Enjoy your last night of pretending you have any dignity left, Claire Gavin wrote. I hope whatever cheap, infested motel you are staying in has hot water. Tomorrow at mediation, I am officially cutting you off for good. You are walking away with nothing but your worthless public relations business and $50,000 in crushing debt. Do not bother crying or begging the mediator for a handout. I am completely done dealing with a loser. Mr. Harrison shook his head in sheer disbelief at the audacity. Donovan simply laughed quietly, packing his folders back into his briefcase. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. Gavin was so incredibly blind. He was standing right on the tracks with a massive freight train bearing down on him, and he was still busy admiring his own reflection in the mirror. He truly believed he had won. He believed I was shaking in a cheap motel room, terrified of what tomorrow would bring. I did not write a long paragraph back. I did not defend myself, and I certainly did not explain that I was currently standing in a luxury penthouse suite holding the keys to his entire destruction. I simply typed a single line, hit send, and turned my phone completely off. See you at mediation tomorrow. The morning of the mediation was bright and remarkably clear. A sharp contrast to the stormy day Gavin had thrown my belongings out onto the porch. I woke up in my penthouse suite feeling completely rested. I ordered room service, drank a freshly brewed espresso, and prepared for the most important performance of my entire life. The mediation was taking place at a neutral, high-end arbitration firm in the center of the financial district. I arrived 15 minutes early, but I did not go straight into the room. I stood in the hallway, sipping a bottle of sparkling water flanked by my legal team. Through the slightly cracked mahogany door of the conference room, I could hear the unmistakable sound of loud, arrogant laughter. I stepped just close enough to peer through the narrow gap. The entire toxic family had shown up to witness my supposed downfall. They were treating a legal divorce mediation like a victory lap. The mediator, an older gentleman with silver hair, was sitting silently at the head of the table, organizing his files and trying to ignore the chaotic energy of my husband's entourage. Gavin was seated at the center of the massive glass table, leaning back in his leather chair, with his hands tucked behind his head. He was wearing a dark navy suit, bragging loudly to his discount lawyer Caldwell about the golf trip he was planning for next month. Sitting right next to him was Sienna. She was dressed in a tight cream-colored maternity dress, resting her hand on her baby bump, completely oblivious to the fact that her dream mansion had been purchased by me the day before. Nolan and Kendra were lounging on the modern leather sofa in the corner of the room. They had absolutely no legal reason to be at this mediation, but Gavin had clearly invited them just to rub my face in the dirt. Kendra was adjusting the strap of her bright orange Birkin bag, complaining to Nolan about the morning traffic. Nolan was checking his expensive watch, looking thoroughly bored, completely unaware that he no longer had a job to go back to after this meeting. I bet she shows up in that same pathetic black sweater she wore to the birthday dinner, Kendra said, her voice carrying clearly into the hallway. She probably spent the whole night crying in some cheap motel over her failing business. Do not give her a single dime, Gavin. She needs to learn how the real world works. Gavin chuckled, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. Are you kidding me? He replied confidently. By the time Caldwell is done presenting her business debts to the mediator, she will be begging me to just let her walk away without owing me money. I am completely protected. The financial waiver is signed and filed. She has absolutely nothing left to take. I took a slow, deep breath. The time for hiding was officially over. I handed my water bottle to Mr. Harrison's assistant. I smoothed my hands down the sides of my outfit. I was not wearing a faded sweater. I was wearing a crisp, immaculate, custom-tailored black Tom Ford suit that cost exactly $8,000. Paired with designer stilettos and a minimalist diamond necklace, I looked exactly like what I was. A woman worth $72 million who was about to completely destroy the people who had wronged her. Mr. Harrison stood to my right, clutching his thick leather briefcase. To my left were two of his senior partners, both towering, imposing men in charcoal suits who looked like absolute apex predators ready to feed. I reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. They swung wide with a solid, authoritative thud that echoed instantly through the large conference room. The laughter died in Gavin's throat. The arrogant smirk vanished from Kendra's face. She had been holding her phone up, likely ready to record my miserable entrance, but her hand slowly dropped to her lap. Nolan sat up straight on the sofa, his eyes widening in complete shock. Even Caldwell, the cheap lawyer, physically flinched back in his chair when he saw the overwhelming legal firepower walking into the room. I did not walk in with my head bowed. I did not have tears in my eyes. I strode to the opposite side of the glass table, my expensive heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. My three corporate litigators fanned out behind me, placing their heavy briefcases onto the table in unison. The sheer intimidation factor was suffocating. Gavin stared at me, his jaw completely slack. He looked at my designer suit, then at my flawless hair, and finally at the three incredibly expensive lawyers, standing like a wall of armor behind my chair. His brain was desperately trying to process the visual information, completely failing to reconcile the wealthy, powerful woman standing in front of him with the pathetic, broken wife he thought he had discarded. Good morning, Gavin. I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. Let us talk about your assets. Gavin stared at me from across the glass table, his brain struggling to process the visual contradiction of my presence. For 5 years, he had conditioned himself to see me as a weak, dependent burden. Now faced with my custom-tailored suit and a wall of elite corporate litigators, his massive ego instinctively went into overdrive to protect his reality. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark of defensive panic. Are you actually out of your mind? Gavin asked, leaning forward and planting his hands firmly on the table. You rented a designer outfit and put a high-priced legal team on a high-interest credit card just to come in here and posture. You are $50,000 in debt, Claire. You have absolutely zero assets to talk about. I did not bother answering him. Mr. Harrison pulled out a leather executive chair for me and I sat down with perfectly measured grace. My three lawyers took their seats, simultaneously opening their briefcases and neatly arranging their impeccable organized files. The silver-haired mediator cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in the room's power dynamic. Let us please maintain professional decorum, the mediator instructed, adjusting his reading glasses. We are here to finalize the separation of assets and debts. Mr. Caldwell, you submitted an expedited agreement yesterday. Would you like to proceed? Caldwell Gavin's discount? Lawyer puffed out his chest and stood up. He clearly felt completely out of his depth standing across from Mr. Harrison, but he tried to mask it with an aggressive, pompous attitude. Yes, Your Honor, Caldwell said, adopting a theatrical tone. My client Gavin has decided to take the high road in this unfortunate situation. As we have documented, the wife's public relations business carries significant debt, while my client's recent startup venture has unfortunately failed. To save the court's time and spare everyone a lengthy battle, my client graciously proposed a clean break. Caldwell reached into his battered briefcase and pulled out the post-nuptial separation agreement I had signed at the coffee shop. He held it up like a winning lottery ticket. Both parties have signed this binding contract, Caldwell announced proudly. It includes a strict, irrevocable waiver of financial discovery. We are asking the mediator to stamp this as a $0 settlement. Gavin keeps his personal accounts and his business. Claire keeps her firm and her debts. Gavin is generously allowing her to walk away without taking any of his remaining savings. With a smug, self-satisfied smirk, Caldwell slid the signed document across the smooth glass surface of the conference table. It stopped directly in front of Mr. Harrison. Gavin crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, looking at me with a triumphant, condescending sneer. He was waiting for me to break down. He was waiting for my expensive rented lawyers to realize there was no money to be squeezed from him and abandon me right there in the room. Nolan and Kendra watched from the corner sofa, exchanging amused glances, fully expecting me to burst into tears. Mr. Harrison did not flinch. He slowly reached out and placed his hand flat over the document. He looked at the signature lines, verified the heavy notary stamp from Marissa, and then looked directly at the mediator. Just to be absolutely clear on the official record, Mr. Harrison said, his deep voice commanding the entire room. This waiver of financial discovery is fully executed, legally binding, and uncontested by your client, Mr. Caldwell. Absolutely, Caldwell snapped back immediately, entirely eager to lock in his supposed victory. It is airtight. Gavin waives his right to her assets, and she waives her right to his. No audits, no lookbacks, no future claims. Mr. Harrison smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that belonged to a predator who had just successfully trapped its prey. He picked up the document and handed it to one of his senior partners to file away in our permanent records. In that case, Mr. Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority, we gladly accept. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single heavy folder bearing the gold-embossed crest of our wealth management firm. He opened it and slid a certified, legally authenticated banking ledger across the table directly toward the mediator. By executing this waiver, Mr. Harrison continued, every word landing like a physical blow in the quiet room. This legally confirms that Mr. Gavin permanently and irrevocably waives any and all rights, claims, or entitlements to my client's separate and inherited assets. Specifically, the $72 million trust fund disbursed to Mrs. Claire following the recent passing of her father. The words $72 million seemed to hang in the chilled air conditioning of the conference room, defying the laws of gravity. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then the physical reality of the statement violently hit the other side of the table. Sienna gasped sharply, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. The heavy smartphone she had been holding slipped from her fingers, crashing loudly onto the glass table and sliding off the edge to shatter against the marble floor. Gavin completely froze. His arrogant sneer did not just fade, it was instantly wiped away, replaced by a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror. Every single drop of blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stared wildly at the banking ledger sitting in front of the mediator, his eyes wide and frantic, desperately trying to compute the sheer astronomical magnitude of the wealth he had just voluntarily signed away. Over on the corner sofa, Kendra let out a choked, breathless sound, her grip on her designer handbag going completely slack. Nolan sat paralyzed, his eyes darting between my calm, collected face and the devastating document on the table. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of my slow, steady breathing as I sat back and watched my husband realize he had just thrown away an empire. The absolute silence in the conference room lasted for exactly 10 seconds before Gavin's brain completely rejected reality. The cognitive dissonance was simply too massive. He could not accept that the woman he had spent 5 years belittling, the woman he had literally thrown out into the rain, was now holding a fortune that dwarfed his wildest corporate fantasies. He stood up so violently that his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed into the wooden credenza behind him. The loud bang made Sienna jump in her seat, but Gavin did not even look at her. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. "This is a bluff," he screamed, his voice cracking with a toxic mixture of rage and sheer panic. "This is an absolute joke. You rented these suits, Claire. You printed out some fake documents to scare me into dropping your business debt." He slammed both hands down on the glass table, leaning forward until his face was red and covered in a thin sheen of sweat. "I knew your father. He was a pathetic broke alcoholic who lived in a rundown apartment and could not even afford a reliable car. He did not have $72 to his name, let alone $72 million. You are running a scam." Mr. Harrison did not even blink. He simply gestured toward the certified banking ledger resting in front of the mediator. Caldwell, despite being a discount attorney, knew a certified federal banking document when he saw one. His hands were physically shaking as he reached out and pulled the ledger closer. He ran his thumb over the raised gold seal of authenticity. He scanned the massive string of zeros on the final balance line. Gavin Caldwell whispered all the arrogant bluster completely drained from his raspy voice. He looked up at my husband with wide, terrified eyes. "Gavin, look at the watermarks. Look at the federal stamp. This is real." "Shut up, Caldwell," Gavin barked, snatching the ledger out of his own lawyer's hands. He stared at the numbers, his eyes darting frantically across the page, as if looking for a typo to save his life. No, this is impossible. Where would a drunk get this kind of money? It makes absolutely no sense." Without raising his voice, Mr. Harrison calmly reached back into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a pristine, heavy stock envelope. He opened the clasp and extracted a thick stack of original corporate certificates, their edges bordered in intricate green and gold ink. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he slid the certificates across the glass table. They fanned out perfectly, coming to a stop directly under Gavin's nose. "Your late father-in-law did indeed struggle with personal demons in his early years." Mr. Harrison explained, his tone conversational, but laced with lethal precision. "However, what he lacked in lifestyle choices he made up for in visionary investing. 30 years ago, he quietly poured his life savings into a small, highly speculative biotech startup. He became one of the original founding shareholders." Mr. Harrison paused, letting Gavin read the bold, embossed letters at the top of the certificates. That startup was Biomedics. He chose to live a modest private life to keep his massive wealth completely hidden from the public eye. Upon his death, his shares were automatically liquidated into the trust fund you see before you. Fully vested, entirely legitimate, and legally inherited by my client. Gavin knew Biomedics. Everyone in the corporate tech and medical sales world knew Biomedics. It was a global titan. The reality of the certificates sitting on the table crashed down onto his shoulders like a collapsing building. His knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the glass table to steady himself, taking ragged, shallow breaths as his entire world unraveled. He realized exactly what he had done. If he had just played the part of the grieving, supportive husband, if he had not rushed to file the divorce papers on the day of the funeral to punish me, he would have been legally entitled to fight for half of that empire. $36 million had been sitting right in his living room waiting for him. But he was so greedy, so eager to hide his own stolen cash, that he locked himself out completely. Sienna let out a soft, horrified whimper, realizing she had just hitched her wagon to a man who had fumbled generational wealth for a measly $500,000. Over on the sofa, Nolan and Kendra sat frozen like statues, their faces pale, the reality of my absolute power finally dawning on them. I leaned forward, resting my forearms gracefully on the cool glass table. I looked directly into Gavin's panicked, bloodshot eyes. The mask of the terrified dependent wife was dead and buried. I let him feel the absolute devastation of his own monumental hubris. "Your own contract to hide your mistress's money just locked you out of an empire, Gavin," I said coldly. Gavin's legs finally gave out. The sheer weight of his catastrophic mistake crashed down on him, stripping away every last ounce of his carefully curated corporate bravado. He collapsed directly onto the polished marble floor of the conference room. It was not a graceful descent. He hit his knees hard, his expensive navy suit wrinkling as he looked up at me from the ground. The man who had towered over me in our living room, who had commanded me to take my trash and leave, was now physically groveling at my designer stilettos. He reached out, his hands visibly shaking, and desperately tried to grab my fingers. I violently yanked my hand away before he could even brush against my skin. I took a deliberate step back, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Claire, baby, please," Gavin begged, his voice high-pitched and frantic. His eyes were wide and pleading, completely stripped of their usual arrogance. "You have to listen to me. I was not thinking straight. I have been out of my mind with stress over my business. You know how much pressure I am under. I did not mean any of those things I said to you. I love you. I have always loved you. We are husband and wife. We can fix this. We can tear up this agreement right now and start over." He turned his desperate gaze toward the silver-haired mediator sitting at the head of the table. "Tear it up," Gavin ordered, though it sounded more like a pathetic whine. "The waiver is invalid. I was under extreme emotional duress. I withdraw my signature." The mediator simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Gavin with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "I am afraid that is completely impossible, Mr. Gavin. You provided a mobile notary. You willingly submitted this document to my office less than 10 minutes ago, stating it was mutually beneficial. The ink is dry, and the agreement is legally binding." Gavin let out a choked, guttural sob. He turned back to me, clasping his hands together, like a child begging for forgiveness. "Claire, you cannot do this to me. I supported you for 5 years. I paid the mortgage. I fed you. You owe me. We built a life together. That money is supposed to be for our future." I stared down at him, my face a mask of absolute ice. "You did not want a future with me, Gavin," I said, my voice slicing through his pathetic tears. "You wanted a punching bag. You threw my clothes out into a thunderstorm on the exact day I buried my father. You paraded your pregnant mistress in front of your entire family and allowed your mother to humiliate me in public. You extorted me for my last $30,000 just to cover my business debt, all while you were buying Cartier diamonds for another woman. Do not you dare sit on that floor and tell me you love me. You only love my money, and now you will never touch a single dime of it." While Gavin sobbed on the marble floor, the reality of the situation was rapidly processing in another part of the room. Sienna had been standing frozen near her chair, her hands clutching her maternity dress. Her eyes darted from the heavy gold-embossed banking ledger on the table to my $8,000 custom suit, and finally down to the pathetic broken man weeping on his knees. The gears in Sienna's head finally clicked into place. She realized exactly what the financial waiver meant. Gavin had not just locked me out of his secret $500,000, he had permanently locked himself out of a $72 million fortune. Half of that money, $36 million, could have legally been his if he had simply stayed married or filed for a standard divorce without hiding assets. Sienna's sweet, demure persona vanished in an instant. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute fury. She stepped forward, her designer heels clicking sharply against the floor, and stopped right behind Gavin. "You signed it," Sienna whispered, her voice trembling with an entirely different kind of rage. Gavin flinched, looking back at her over his shoulder. Sienna's voice began to rise, echoing loudly off the conference room walls. "You actually signed away $36 million, you idiot! You arrogant, stupid idiot! You told me you had a master plan. You told me you were going to crush her and leave her with nothing. Instead, you just gave away an entire empire because you were too cheap to split a savings account." Gavin tried to stand up, reaching out to her. "Sienna, baby, calm down. We still have the money I put away. We can still buy the mansion." "You do not even have the mansion," Sienna screamed at the top of her lungs, completely losing her mind. "The realtor called me this morning. Some anonymous cash buyer stole the house right out from under us. We have nothing. You are a completely broke, unemployed failure who just threw away a lottery ticket." The room erupted into total chaos as Sienna continued to scream at him, her voice bouncing off the glass walls. But the carnage was not over. Gavin's destruction was only the first item on my agenda. I turned my attention away from the screaming couple and slowly shifted my gaze toward the corner sofa, locking eyes with my brother-in-law Nolan and his snobby wife Kendra. It was their turn. Sienna's shrill voice continued to echo off the glass walls, raining insults down on Gavin, who was still slumped on the marble floor in a state of catatonic shock. He was completely broken, staring blankly at the polished tiles as his mistress verbally tore him to shreds over his monumental stupidity. But I had already tuned them out. My eyes were locked entirely on the modern leather sofa in the corner of the room. Kendra had watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of horror and growing indignation. She came from a family of wealthy corporate lawyers, and her entire identity was built on the belief that she was inherently superior to everyone around her, especially me. Seeing me completely dismantle her golden boy brother-in-law was too much for her massive ego to handle. She could not accept that the woman she had mocked just yesterday was now holding all the cards. Kendra stood up, gripping the handle of her bright orange designer bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She marched over to the glass table, stepping right past the weeping Gavin. "You think you are so incredibly smart, do you not?" Kendra snapped, her voice trembling with fury as she glared at me. "You stumble into some dead man's money, and suddenly you think you can walk in here and ruin people's lives? You are nothing but a vindictive, bitter woman, Claire. My father is a senior partner at one of the top law firms in this city. If you think you can just terrorize this family and walk away, you have another thing coming. We will drag you into litigation so deep you will spend half that inheritance just paying legal fees." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her finish her little tantrum. I slowly turned my gaze away from her angry face and looked directly at Nolan, who was still sitting frozen on the sofa. He was sweating profusely, his face entirely drained of color. Unlike his wife, Nolan understood exactly what kind of power $72 million in liquid cash could wield in the corporate world. "Kendra," I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You love bragging about Nolan's executive job, right? You love telling everyone how he is a regional director, how he closes massive commercial deals, and how his salary pays for that ridiculous handbag you are holding." Kendra lifted her chin defiantly. "He earned his position," she spat back. "He actually works for his money, unlike you." I offered her a cold, empty smile. Guess who just bought his firm? The defiance instantly vanished from Kendra's eyes, replaced by a deep, sudden confusion. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly as she tried to process my words. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. I did not answer her. I gestured to Mr. Harrison, who calmly reached into his heavy briefcase for the third time that morning. He pulled out a crisp white folder and placed it directly in front of me. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing the official corporate letterhead of Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate. Yesterday afternoon, my holding company successfully acquired 51% of the voting shares at Pinnacle, Y announced, making sure my voice carried over the sound of Sienna still berating Gavin in the background. I am the new majority shareholder, and my very first executive order was to dispatch a team of forensic corporate auditors to lock down the entire regional division. Nolan let out a sharp, ragged gasp. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake. "They did not just find the fake software startup you used to help Gavin launder his marital assets." "Nolan," I continued, speaking directly to the man on the sofa. "The auditors dug much deeper than that. They found the fake vendor invoices. They found the manipulated escrow accounts. They found the absolute undeniable proof that you have been heavily embezzling from Pinnacle for the last 3 years to fund your luxury lifestyle." Kendra stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "Nolan, what is she talking about?" Kendra demanded, her voice cracking. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her." Nolan did not look up. He just shook his head back and forth, quietly sobbing into his palms. I picked up the document from the table and held it out. "This is your official notice of immediate termination, Nolan." I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Corporate security already seized your laptop and your company vehicle this morning. Furthermore, my legal team has forwarded the complete audit findings to the federal authorities. You are not just fired. You are going to federal prison. Kendra looked down at her expensive clothes, her diamond rings and the luxury bag in her hand, suddenly realizing that every single piece of her perfect snobby lifestyle had been purchased with stolen corporate funds. The illusion of her superiority shattered completely. She dropped her designer bag onto the floor, covered her face with both hands, and burst into loud, hysterical tears. The sound of Kendra's hysterical sobbing filled the conference room, a sharp contrast to the arrogant laughter that had greeted me when I first walked through those heavy mahogany doors. Nolan sat beside her, staring blankly at the polished marble floor, his entire corporate identity reduced to a sheet of termination paper. But as satisfying as it was to watch my snobby in-laws face the consequences of their own greed, the main event was still waiting. I turned my attention back to my soon-to-be ex-husband. Gavin had stopped pleading. He was simply kneeling there, looking like a hollow shell of the man who had confidently demanded I sign away my life savings just a few days prior. I nodded to Mr. Harrison. My attorney reached into his briefcase for the final time. He withdrew a thick red tabbed folder and dropped it onto the glass table. It landed with a heavy definitive thud that made Gavin physically flinch. Caldwell Gavin's discount lawyer looked at the red folder as if it were an active explosive device. He did not reach for it. He simply pushed his chair back, physically distancing himself from his own client. "What is that?" Gavin whispered, his voice completely hoarse. He slowly pulled himself up from the floor, swaying slightly as he grabbed the back of his leather chair for support. "That is the final nail in your coffin, Gavin," I said smoothly. I stepped closer to the table, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "While you were busy gloating to your mistress about how easily you tricked your idiot wife, my private investigator was busy tracking the $500,000 you hid in a fake Delaware shell company." Gavin's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "I know everything about the ghost lease," I continued, my voice echoing with icy precision. "I know about the wire transfers you labeled as seed investments. I know you colluded with Nolan to launder marital assets so you could claim bankruptcy in this mediation and leave me drowning in my business debt. You really thought you were the smartest man in the room. You thought you could outwit the family court and walk away with your pockets full." Gavin frantically shook his head, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Claire, listen to me. I can undo it. I will wire the money back into our joint account right now. You can have half. You can have all of it, every single cent. Just please do not show that folder to the mediator." Mr. Harrison offered a cold, humorless chuckle. "You are entirely missing the point, Mr. Gavin. We have no intention of showing this to a family court mediator." Mr. Harrison opened the folder, revealing pages of highlighted bank ledgers and corporate filings. "Hiding marital assets during a divorce is a serious offense in family court," my attorney explained, his tone strictly professional. "But creating a fraudulent corporate entity, falsifying business records, and executing interstate wire transfers to hide $500,000 from the federal government is a completely different ballgame." Gavin stopped breathing. The faint color that had returned to his face vanished entirely. "We bypassed the family court completely," Mr. Harrison continued. "Yesterday afternoon, my legal team officially submitted this entire comprehensive dossier to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Prosecutor's Office. You committed tax fraud, wire fraud, and perjury." Hearing those words, Caldwell violently shoved his chair back. He hastily grabbed his documents and shoved them into his battered briefcase. "I cannot represent a client who is actively under federal investigation for fraud," Caldwell announced, his voice shaking. "I am formally withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately. Do not contact my office." Caldwell practically ran out of the conference room, leaving Gavin entirely isolated. Gavin stumbled backward, hitting the wall. "No!" he gasped, clutching his chest, as if he could not pull in enough oxygen. "No, you cannot do that. I am a corporate director. I have a clean record. You are going to send me to federal prison." "You sent yourself to prison, Gavin," I corrected him, my voice unwavering. "You were so incredibly greedy that you crossed federal lines just to make sure I suffered. He scrambled toward his discarded phone on the table, his fingers shaking wildly across the screen. "I am moving the money," he muttered to himself in a state of absolute delusion. "I am transferring it offshore right now. They cannot trace it if I move it to the Caymans." I watched him frantically open his banking application, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. "Save your battery, Gavin," I said softly. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and panicked. "When you submit airtight evidence of $500,000 in felony tax evasion, the federal government moves incredibly fast," I explained, enjoying the absolute despair washing over his face. "You cannot transfer the money, you cannot hire a new defense lawyer, you cannot even buy a cup of coffee on your way out of this building." Gavin stared at his phone screen. I watched his jaw drop as bright red error messages flashed across his display, denying his access over and over again. "The IRS froze every single bank account tied to your name and your fake shell company. At 8 o'clock this morning," I told him, delivering the final crushing blow. "You are not just facing federal prison, Gavin. You are completely and utterly destitute." The red error messages flashing across Gavin's phone screen cast a faint, harsh glow on his pale face. He tapped the glass frantically over and over as if hitting refresh would somehow magically unfreeze the accounts and erase the federal investigation. But the screen remained locked. Standing just a few feet away, Sienna had been watching the display over his shoulder. The reality of those error messages finally broke through her greed-induced delusion. The luxury mansion was gone, the $500,000 was gone, and the man she was standing next to was no longer a wealthy corporate director. He was a broke, terrified suspect facing imminent federal indictment. Sienna let out a sound that was half gasp, half growl. She reached up to her throat, her manicured fingers grabbing the diamond Cartier necklace Gavin had flaunted at the family dinner. She fumbled with the clasp for a second, her hands shaking with pure rage. When it did not easily open, she let out a frustrated scream and simply yanked. The delicate white gold chain snapped against her neck. She threw the broken necklace directly at Gavin. The diamonds hit him squarely in the chest and clattered onto the polished marble floor, scattering like cheap glass. "You absolute pathetic loser!" Sienna screamed, her voice completely devoid of the sweet, breathy tone she usually weaponized. "You promised me a luxury life. You told me you were a genius and that you had outsmarted your wife. But you are nothing. You are a broke, arrogant criminal who just threw away $36 million because you were too cheap to be honest." Gavin reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Sienna, please. You have to stay. We are having a baby." Sienna laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the glass walls. "I am not going down with a sinking ship. I am not spending the best years of my life visiting a broke loser in federal prison. Do not ever contact me again." She grabbed her designer purse from the table, turned on her heel, and stormed toward the exit. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind her, the final echoing boom sealing Gavin's absolute isolation. But the carnage inside the room was far from over. With Sienna gone, the remaining members of the toxic family immediately turned their fangs on each other. There was no loyalty left, only the desperate animalistic instinct to survive. Nolan surged up from the leather sofa, his face contorted in a mask of sheer panic and fury. He marched toward his brother, pointing an accusing finger. "This is entirely your fault," Nolan bellowed. "You dragged me into this. You begged me to help you set up that Delaware shell company to hide your money. If you had just paid her what you owed, the corporate auditors never would have raided my office. You ruined my life." Gavin, still kneeling on the floor, snapped his head up, his own rage finally boiling over his terror. "You ruined your own life, you idiot!" Gavin screamed back, his voice cracking. "You were embezzling from Pinnacle years before I ever asked you for a favor. You stole corporate funds just to buy your snobby wife her ugly handbags. Do not, you dare put this on me." Kendra gasped, her tear-streaked face twisting into an ugly scowl. She rounded on Nolan, physically shoving his shoulder. "You told me you earned those bonuses. You told me you were a top executive. You made me look like a fool in front of my entire family. You are going to prison, Nolan. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this building." Nolan spun around to face his wife. "You gladly spent every single stolen dime, Kendra. Do not act like you are an innocent victim. The conference room devolved into a chaotic, vicious screaming match. Brother fought against brother, husband screamed at wife. They viciously tore each other apart, trading insults and placing blame, completely abandoning the polished, wealthy facade they had maintained for years. They were nothing but rats trapped in a burning building, fiercely turning on one another as the flames closed in. I stood quietly on the opposite side of the glass table watching the implosion. For 5 long years, I had allowed these people to make me feel small. I had endured their gaslighting, their condescension, and their relentless cruelty. But looking at them now screaming and crying on the floor of a rented legal office, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, not even a trace of pity. Mr. Harrison calmly closed his thick leather briefcase, the solid click of the brass locks cutting cleanly through the screaming. I looked at my elite legal team, offering them a small, satisfied nod. I did not need to say a single parting word. My $72 million, my new corporate empire, and the federal indictments waiting for them spoke loud enough. I stood up perfectly straight. I casually reached down and adjusted the crisp lapels of my custom Tom Ford suit, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle. I turned my back on my former husband and his imploding family, and I walked out the heavy mahogany doors without looking back a single time, leaving them to burn in the hell they had built with their own hands. The fallout from the mediation room did not stay confined to those glass walls. The federal government operates with terrifying efficiency when presented with a perfectly packaged dossier of wire fraud and tax evasion. Within 48 hours, Gavin's entire existence was systematically dismantled. Because the Internal Revenue Service froze every single account tied to his Social Security number, all of his automated payments bounced instantly. That included the massive mortgage on the pristine suburban house he had so proudly kicked me out of. The bank alerted to the federal criminal investigation, and the freezing of his assets wasted absolutely no time. They initiated immediate foreclosure and eviction procedures, seizing the property as collateral against his mounting debts. A bright neon orange foreclosure notice was securely taped to the front door, a glaring public broadcast of his financial ruin. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon when I decided to take a drive through my old neighborhood. I was not behind the wheel of my beat-up, rattling sedan anymore. Instead, I was sitting in the spacious back seat of a brand-new custom black Maybach, sipping sparkling water while my private chauffeur, Thomas, smoothly navigated the familiar suburban streets. I wanted to see the house one last time to fully close that painful chapter of my life and replace the memory of my tearful departure with the reality of my new freedom. I did not actually expect to catch the final act of Gavin's downfall playing out in real time on the sidewalk. As the Maybach glided silently around the corner and approached the house, I tapped the glass partition, instructing Thomas to slow down. There, standing at the end of the driveway, was Gavin. It was a poetic, almost cinematic reversal of the day. He threw my belongings onto the wet porch. He was not wearing a tailored designer suit or an expensive luxury watch. He was wearing faded sweatpants and a wrinkled gray t-shirt, looking exhausted, disheveled, and completely defeated. He was dragging heavy black plastic trash bags down the driveway, physically hauling them to the curb. His luxury SUV was nowhere to be seen, likely already repossessed by the dealership or seized by federal agents. He was sweating profusely under the afternoon sun, struggling with the cheap plastic bags. He looked frantic and panicked, rushing to get his belongings off the property before the bank sent someone to change the locks. As he yanked one of the heavy bags over the edge of the concrete, the thin plastic caught on a stray branch of the manicured hedge and ripped completely open. A tangled mess of expensive silk ties, custom dress shirts, and golf polos spilled out onto the dirty pavement. Gavin dropped to his knees, frantically trying to gather his ruined wardrobe and shove the clothes back into the torn plastic. He looked so incredibly small, so entirely stripped of the power and arrogance that used to define him. A few neighbors walking their dogs were actively staring at him, whispering to each other. He had spent years curating an image of untouchable perfection for these people, and now he was nothing more than the neighborhood spectacle, hitting absolute rock bottom for everyone to see. Thomas brought the Maybach to a smooth, silent stop directly in front of the driveway. The sleek, massive luxury vehicle cast a long, imposing shadow over Gavin. He stopped grabbing at his clothes and slowly looked up from the dirt. He squinted against the bright sunlight, trying to peer through the heavily tinted windows. He probably thought it was one of his old corporate buddies, or perhaps a high-priced defense lawyer finally arriving to rescue him from his nightmare. I pressed the silver button on the leather armrest. The tinted window slid down with a quiet, expensive hum. Gavin's eyes widened in absolute shock when he saw me sitting comfortably in the plush, pristine interior. His jaw went completely slack. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He just knelt there in the dirt, surrounded by his garbage, staring at the woman he had completely underestimated and cruelly discarded. The contrast between us could not have been more absolute. I was the embodiment of the wealth he had desperately tried to steal, and he was sitting in the literal wreckage of his own hubris. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my wallet. I did not say a single word about the fraud, the mistress, or the $72 million he had signed away. I did not need to scream or gloat. The undeniable reality of our reversed positions spoke volumes. I slipped a crisp $5 bill from my cash clip. I held it out the window, let it slip from my fingers, and watched it flutter down to land right on top of his ripped trash bag. I looked down at him with a perfectly calm, icy smile. "For your rent," I said. I pressed the button to roll the window up and tapped the glass partition. "Drive, Thomas." As the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Gavin was still kneeling on the concrete, clutching the $5 bill in his dirty hand, completely alone. 6 months passed, and the dust from the explosive divorce mediation finally settled, revealing a completely altered landscape. The federal wheels of justice ground forward slowly, but with terrifying certainty. Gavin was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. With his assets permanently frozen and his corporate reputation completely annihilated, he could not afford to hire another high-powered defense attorney. He was assigned a public defender who bluntly informed him that a plea deal was his only realistic option to avoid spending a decade behind bars. While awaiting his federal trial, Gavin was forced to find a way to survive. The man who used to boast about closing massive tech deals over expensive steak dinners was now working the evening shift as a line cook at a crowded, greasy diner on the outskirts of the city. He spent his nights flipping burgers and scrubbing industrial grills for minimum wage, returning every morning to a cramped, noisy studio apartment he rented by the week. He had no car, no savings, and no future. Sienna had completely disappeared from his life, changing her phone number and moving across the state the day after the mediation. His brother Nolan fared no better. The corporate auditors at Pinnacle Commercial Real Estate had handed over a mountain of irrefutable evidence regarding his embezzlement scheme. Nolan was fired, disgraced, and publicly exposed. The moment the federal agents showed up at their suburban home to confiscate his luxury vehicles and electronics, Kendra did exactly what she had promised. She filed for divorce. Kendra tried to salvage her reputation by playing the victim, claiming she had absolutely no idea her lavish lifestyle was funded by stolen money. She moved back into her parents' wealthy estate, utterly humiliated, leaving Nolan to face the legal consequences entirely on his own. He was currently unemployed, living in a cheap motel, and waiting for his own federal indictment to drop. The arrogant, untouchable golden boys of the family had been completely stripped of their false empires. As for me, I did exactly what Gavin had sworn I could never do. I succeeded. I took a small strategic portion of my $72 million trust fund and injected it directly into my struggling public relations firm. I did not just pay off the $50,000 business debt. I completely rebranded the company. I hired top-tier talent, poached brilliant marketing executives from rival agencies, and acquired state-of-the-art software. I transformed my small, failing business into a powerhouse media and communications empire. Within 6 months, we were landing massive national accounts. The very same corporate clients Gavin had threatened to turn against me were now eagerly signing multi-million-dollar retainer contracts with my agency. I was no longer begging local businesses for social media work. I was sitting at the head of boardroom tables, dictating terms and completely dominating the market. It was a brisk Tuesday morning when Thomas, my chauffeur, pulled the Maybach up to the gleaming glass entrance of the downtown skyscraper that now served as my corporate headquarters. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp city air. I was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored ivory suit. I walked through the grand lobby, no longer the timid, broken woman who had cowered under Gavin's constant belittling. The private elevator whisked me up to the top floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped into a bustling, vibrant office space. Natural light flooded the room through massive windows. Dozens of employees were actively working, collaborating, and moving with purposeful energy. As I walked down the central corridor, the atmosphere shifted. It was not a shift of fear or intimidation, but one of genuine respect. Employees looked up from their desks, offering warm smiles and bright morning greetings. My lead marketing director, a brilliant woman I had personally recruited, handed me a fresh coffee and a briefing folder, speaking excitedly about a massive international campaign we had just successfully launched. I thanked her and continued walking toward the end of the hall, pushing open the heavy glass door to my new corner office. The space was breathtaking. It featured panoramic views of the entire city, sleek modern furniture, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded respect. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the sprawling metropolis below. I had built this. I had taken the absolute worst moment of my life, the ultimate betrayal, and used it as the foundation to construct an empire that nobody could ever take away from me. I stood at the massive window of my new office, feeling the gentle warmth of the morning sun against my face. Looking down at the sprawling city below, I caught my own reflection in the thick glass. It was strange to look back at the woman I was just a few short months ago. I used to walk on eggshells in my own home, terrified of triggering my husband's volatile temper or earning a condescending sneer from his family. I had bought into the insidious lie that I was lucky to be tolerated. Society often teaches women, especially wives, to be the eternal peacekeepers. We are subtly conditioned to absorb disrespect, to swallow our pride, and to shrink our own ambitions so the men around us can feel larger. For 5 agonizing years, I had actively dimmed my own light to ensure Gavin's fragile ego remained perfectly illuminated. But standing here today, surrounded by the tangible proof of my own resilience, I realize that the most dangerous thing you can do is allow someone else to dictate your value. Gavin and his toxic family looked at me and saw a convenient scapegoat. They saw a quiet, agreeable woman who would simply take whatever emotional scraps they threw at her. They mistook my patience for weakness. They mistook my silence for submission. They did not understand that when a woman stops arguing, stops crying, and stops trying to explain her worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding her, she is not giving up. She is simply gathering her ammunition. The $72 million I inherited from my father was undeniably a massive advantage. I will never pretend otherwise. But the money itself did not defeat Gavin. His own boundless greed defeated him. His own towering arrogance blinded him to the trap he was walking right into with a smile on his face. If he had treated me with even a fraction of basic human decency, if he had not tried to crush me into the dirt just to elevate his pregnant mistress, he would be living a life of unimaginable luxury right now. Instead, his toxicity was his ultimate undoing. That is the beautiful universal truth about people who build their lives on manipulation and deceit. You never actually have to destroy them. You just have to set an unbreakable boundary, step back, and watch them absolutely destroy themselves. To any woman listening to this right now, who feels trapped in a situation where she is constantly undervalued, hear me clearly. You do not need a multi-million-dollar trust fund to take your life back. Your true power does not come from a bank account. It comes from your absolute refusal to accept disrespect. It comes from looking at the people who try to make you feel small and deciding that you are no longer participating in their twisted games. Do not argue with them. Do not plead for them to see your worth. The very moment you have to convince someone that you matter, you have already lost the battle. Walk away. Build your own table. Create a space where you do not have to beg for a seat. It will be terrifying at first. When I was sitting in my beat-up sedan in the pouring rain, looking at my ruined belongings scattered across a wet porch, I was terrified. But that terror was simply the price of admission to my new life. It was the necessary fire that burned away the heavy, suffocating chains I had been dragging around for 5 years. I lost a toxic husband, a cruel sister-in-law, and an entire network of enablers. And in return, I gained my freedom. I no longer shrink when I walk into a room. I do not apologize for my success. I do not hide my ambition to make others feel more secure. The public relations firm that Gavin called worthless is now a titan in the industry, and it is entirely mine. I rebuilt it with my own vision, and I run it strictly on my own terms. I am exactly where I was always meant to be. Sometimes I think back to that tense afternoon in the coffee shop. I think about the smug, victorious look on Gavin's face when he snatched that signed financial waiver off the table. He was so incredibly certain that he had won. He was so completely convinced that he had outsmarted me, outplayed me, and discarded me exactly the way he wanted. He thought he was leaving me with nothing when he threw that divorce paper at me. Instead, he handed me the keys to the rest of my life. I learned that you don't need to scream to win a war. Sometimes silence is the loudest, most expensive revenge of all. The most profound lesson drawn from this story is that true power never requires a raised voice. When faced with blatant disrespect, manipulation, or cruelty, human instinct often urges us to fight back loudly to justify our worth or to beg for basic fairness. However, this narrative masterfully demonstrates that strategic silence and emotional control are infinitely more effective than any screaming match. By maintaining her composure and allowing her husband's own toxic greed to dictate his actions, Claire turned his greatest weapon, his arrogance, directly against him. Furthermore, the story serves as a stark warning about the self-destructive nature of hubris. Gavin and his family were entirely blinded by their own superficial superiority. They fatally underestimated Claire because they falsely equated her quiet endurance with weakness and stupidity. In reality, arrogance makes people sloppy, predictable, and blind to their own vulnerabilities. Gavin's desperate illegal scramble to hide a fraction of his wealth ultimately cost him an unimaginable empire and his freedom. He built his own cage simply because he believed he was untouchable. Ultimately, this is a powerful reminder about reclaiming your independence and establishing unshakable boundaries. You certainly do not need a multi-million-dollar secret trust fund to walk away from a toxic environment. Your greatest, most untouchable asset is your absolute refusal to be continuously devalued. When you finally stop shrinking yourself to fit comfortably into spaces that refuse to respect you, you create the necessary room to build your own table and thrive on your own terms. If you are currently sitting in a room where your worth is constantly questioned, stop negotiating your value with people committed to misunderstanding you and start planning your exit today.